Hi, folks. Welcome to another monthly meeting of OREF, either sadly or joyously online, depending how you look on it. I think it's still great to be, at least to be meeting and mixing, if only in two dimensions at the moment. I'm pleased to say tonight we've got Sandy from Heriot-Watt ICIT here tonight to talk on a quite interesting topic. Is ocean energy about to transform future property rights at sea? That's quite an interesting, and I'm quite intrigued to hear what he's going to say himself on this. So, without much further ado, I would just sort of welcome you to start, Sandy. Do you need to share a screen or anything? Are you happy?
Yeah, I do, and if you just bear with me, I'll try and get that going. If the internet does go down, I know somebody else is using it in the house. I might need to nip off and tell them to stop using it. But if you could just confirm you can see the slide mark.
Yes, I can. That's good.
Okay, that's great. And maybe just pop your microphones off unless you're using a headset, which of course is okay. So thanks very much. I'm really pleased to come along and probably do a slightly different from the kind of I don't mean run of the mill, but it's slightly different kind of topic. Most of you know me. My name is Sandy Kerr, and I work at ICIT Heriot-Watt in the Orkney campus. My background's actually in economics, but I'm particularly interested in marine planning and marine governance, and that's kind of where I'm coming up with this talk tonight. And I'm also really interested in the future of the seas and what, the way that we govern, manage, and ownership of the seas, what that might look like going forward. And that's particularly what I want to talk about tonight in the context of blue growth, which is the marine economy. But in particular, I think offshore wind is the thing that's really going to change this. Now, just before I start, I just want to say that what you need to understand, I am 100% behind offshore wind. As far as I'm concerned, it's the main card that we have to play in the UK in terms of meeting net zero. It's certainly not the only one. I do think it's about to bring radical change in the marine environment. So do not think for a second that anything I say is something against offshore wind. It's about the consequences that might develop from that. So what do I want to talk about tonight? Get the slides to work. Right. I'm exploring this idea that the industrialisation of the seas, which offshore wind is part of, might lead to the sort of creation of property at sea, something similar to what we have on land. So I'm going to just pop up one slide in a moment to looking at what I mean by property, because there's different definitions of it. Then I'm actually going to have a look at land and what happened on land and how land is enclosed, because that's our best model of what might happen in the sea. Then I'm going to talk about the sort of enclosure at sea and the change in nature of blue growth industries, and in particular kind of offshore wind. And then ask the question at the end, is this a problem at all? Maybe Sandy's worried about nothing, but maybe there's something in it, and hopefully we can have a bit of a chat at that point. So what is property? What do you mean by property? Well, most of us, when you mention the word property, you think, well, maybe I'm lucky enough to own a house or some land, and but that's private property. There's different forms of property. And this guy, Daniel Bromley, a few years ago came up with a taxonomy, a list of different types of property that range from sort of open access, where anybody has access to using it. And at one time, everything was open access. When the world was created, it wasn't created with property. That was something that people came along and invented, that idea. So there's open access at one extreme. There's common property, where a group of people, a community, have sort of common access to it. But it's a defined group. Then you got something like state property, and that's really what we have in the sea at the moment, and I'll come back to this, but the state has claimed ownership of resources, and it has the right to govern. And then ultimately, what most of us think about, as I said, is this idea of private property, where there's an individual owns it and often has exclusive access to it. And quite often there's a kind of succession of one. You can think of this in terms of succession as from one to the other. As I said, at one time, way back, everything was open access, and groups of people started accessing resources on land, at sea. The state extended control, and then ultimately sort of private property, is something that was created. It's worth noting as well, just in the last two, state and private properties where law comes in, like formal law. There's legislation governing what people can do, can't, and sort of creating rights. You can have property without law, sort of informal, access to things as well. So what I want to do in the next 3-4 slides is just have a think about, not the sea at all, but I want to think about land. How was kind of property created on land? And how did land become enclosed? How did it, these sort of steps happen on land? Well, you've got to go an awful long way back. In fact, it's hard to really say when property was created on land. But certainly in Europe, if you go back to sort of medieval times, there was a really a process of enclosure started. And in England, there was a whole series of sort of laws instituted right back from the kind of 13th century right into the 18th century with the Enclosure Act of 1773 that enclosed what were common lands. A lot of it was done in the name of efficiency as well, where there was often multiple tenants or multiple sort of common occupiers of land, and they were sort of kicked off the land, sometimes with compensation, in order to create sort of more efficient sort of lumps of land. And this is done in the name of agricultural efficiency. Of course, it was very much for the economic benefit as well, certain players. And a similar process happened in Scotland. If we go back, we've got the oldest sort of land registry in the world in Scotland, Register of Sazins, which is now the Land Register, where your title to land is registered to sort of confirm it. But we've got things in Scotland like what's known as positive prescription, fancy legal term, where what it means is that if you can see land that is unowned, you can claim title to it. If you kind of register your interest in it and nobody opposes it for 25 years, I think it is, then you get title over that. And there was Community Acts, which broke up sort of commons and laws of entail and so on. And finally, we had the Highland clearances. And we've ended up in a situation in Scotland where now less than 400 owners, let's think about this, less than 400 people own over 50% of the land in Scotland. So this is a feature we're going to come back to, this kind of concentration of it as well. Once property rights are created, they tend to be traded, and often it concentrates in the hand of a smaller and smaller number of people. The other thing I want you to remember is that this is a process, not a single act or moment. It's something that went on over a long period of time. Now, the second phase, I've kind of split this into 3 phases, is, well, what did we do? Well, we spread the idea of property around the world, and it is only an idea. But, as long as enough people kind of agree that it's a thing, it becomes a thing. It's like money. Money is not really a thing. It's just an idea that we all agree upon. So very much, in the colonial era, European colonial powers took that idea of property around the world. And a lot of this was, it was done in the name of economic efficiency, sort of bringing sort of Western European agricultural efficiencies to these parts of the world. It's done in the name of that, and also, frankly, to secure a supply of resources back to the European sort of superpowers at the time. And of course, we now recognise that this is done at huge cost to those sort of populations in the lands that were inhabited, and then also it was propped up with slavery as well. This sort of agricultural process in the back of land. So it's something that Europe, an idea that Europe spread around the world. And this idea of property really spread in the back of colonialism, and has come to sort of dominate the land around the world. Oh, didn't think that was the next slide. In the third phase of that I've identified, that by the mid 20th century, first part of the 20th century, really the only places in the world where we didn't have, the only sort of super economic powers, large economic powers in the world where we didn't have private property were the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. But lo and behold, that's changed for better or worse. And that in 1991, with the after perestroika and the collapse of the Soviet Union, a lot of Western financial aid to Russia was contingent. It was made contingent on the fact that the public ownership of land was broken up and it was privatized. And you can argue, a lot of people would, that that's how we ended up with the oligarchs that we have that grabbed, you know, those resources, oil, raw materials in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And even in China, a country that, you know, claims to have a communist party running the country, in 2004, it changed its constitution to allow for the lawful private ownership of land. There we go. The lawful private property of citizens shall be inviolable, and the country shall protect private rights and inheritance rights and property. So even in China, this sort of idea of property is absolutely kind of sacrosanct. And it just seems to be that on land, the idea of private property is intimately intertwined with economic growth and certainly capitalism. Now, I expect I'm going to get the slide that I was expecting to see previously coming up next. I am. There have been critics, you know, over the centuries for sure, and you know, philosophers like John Stuart Mill saying landlords grow richer in their sleep without working, risking, or economizing. And what he was talking about was that the value in land is not created by landowners; it's created by what's happening in the economy round about. The economy is buzzing and things are happening and it's growing. Then the value of property goes up, but the landowner doesn't create that. It's not his effort; it just happens to own the land. And then we had other radicals like Henry George back in the late 19th century in the States, sort of saying the equal right of all men to the use of land is as clear as the equal right to breathe the air. Now, there's lots of people like John Stuart Mill, Henry George have complained about property rights over the decades, centuries even, but you know what? It's had very little impact because it absolutely dominates on land, this sort of idea of private property around the world. Now, there's been a huge number of consequences of that. You can say, yes, it's driven economic growth, and you know that has undoubtedly pulled, you know, millions of people out of poverty. But there are a lot of sort of consequences as well. And there's a whole other presentation here. I need to get to the sea before you all fall asleep. But you know, there's you know, land rights sort of campaigns all around the world today. You know, if we look at sort of logging in the Amazon and the impacts of that and the sort of pushback from Amazonian pine to in North America, where Native North Americans trying to re-establish rights. Go to Africa, think about Zimbabwe and the troubles there in recent years. And often in many cases around the world, this sort of, you know, ends up in violence. It's extremely difficult thing to undo these when they're being created, and please bear that in mind, because of course the people that are holding property rights now are not the people that kind of created them or grabbed the land over many centuries ago. They're sort of, you know, often families that have been there for a very long time, and you know, when traditional rights are being re-established, then you know, those are the people that are now being dispossessed from the land. So the point is, this thing is it's extremely difficult to undo if you don't like the system that gets put in place. But this isn't just about South America, Africa, New Zealand, Australia, Canada. It's a feature in Scotland as well. And as I mentioned earlier, you know, there's been this historic process of enclosure in Scotland. This amazing statistic that 432 people own over half the land in Scotland. It's 5 million people in this country. Over half the land in Scotland. And it's recognised as an injustice. It's recognised as also something in rural Scotland that's impeded development. economic development of communities, where the communities are predominantly sort of tenant farmers, tenant landowners. And to address this, the Land Reform Act in Scotland in 2003 introduced this right to buy. And this is where I start getting on to renewable energy. Finally, you'll be pleased to hear. If you look at many examples where right to buy has been exercised, what the communities have done to try and stimulate the economy, generate some income in many places, is put up wind turbines, renewable energy, in order to generate an income. And the pictures from the bottom there are from the Galston estate, and that's actually, we don't recognise it, but the island of Lewis there. And the trustees from that estate set up an energy company, put up 3 wind turbines, and that's pulling money back into local community. But this right to buy is extremely difficult and expensive and challenging. The Scottish Government and the Scottish Land Fund at one point was putting in about £10 million a year, and they would only part fund the purchase. The communities had to raise the money otherwise. So I'm just making that point again that, you know, land reform is something that's happened everywhere around the world, even Scotland. It's super difficult to undo these, if you want to call them injustices, and I think I would, you know, once they're in place. And this is what we need to think about in the sea, which I'm going to get onto. That it's not where we're at now, it's about where we might end up in the future. It might be very difficult to undo things if we end up in a certain kind of certain place. So let's have a wee think about the sea in terms of this sort of idea of making property at sea. And this is a diagram I've nicked from a PhD student of mine, Stephanie Weir, from a couple of years back. And you can see a very similar process in the sea. We're not as far down the line, it has to be said, but a similar process nonetheless. Where we started with what in the marine legal jargon we call mare liberum, it means free seas. There's a public right of, you know, just complete open access. And then what happened in the really during the course of the 20th century, as we discovered more minerals in the sea, particularly oil in the Gulf of Mexico in the 1950s, and as we developed the ability to control the seas, well, not control the seas, but, you know, map them, police them, control the resources, then states started to take more and more of an interest. So we had the Law of the Sea Convention, which established exclusive economic zones out to 200 nautical miles, and states have said they've got exclusive access to the resources out to 200 nautical miles. It's a relatively recent thing. Went back 100 years, it was only like different parts of the world, some 3, 6, or maybe 9 miles in different parts of the world, because the rest of the seas were treated as open access. I would argue that blue growth, the industrialisation of the seas, which I'm going to get on and think about in 2 or 3 slides' time, is starting to lead to the creation of more private rights. Now, we don't have in the UK and around Europe sort of private property in quite the same way like you own in your house, but we are starting to give individual rights to resource users. Fishermen have been given individual tradable quota, a property right, something they can buy and sell in quota. We're starting to give planning permission to, we've been giving it for a number of years now, to aquaculture, which gives it exclusive right to the seas. But that's all quite small spatially, and when you compare it with what might happen, what is going to happen with offshore winds. So I'd say that I would argue, and hopefully you'll see in the next few slides, that there is a process of enclosure happening in the seas, and it's increasingly creating increasingly individualized rights. We're kind of giving companies, people, you know, rights over certain resources in certain parts of the sea. And I would argue this is just what we saw on land, and why should it be any different anyway than what happened on land? So moving on, check my time. 16 minutes, we finished early. So just sort of think about what this kind of blue economy is, these sort of new, well, some old, some new industries. I'm going to look at the fishing industry in a minute, but it was interesting when we, with my PhD students, sort of talked to some fishermen about this sort of idea of ownership of quota. And, you know, some people are uneasy about the fact that fishermen have been given private property rights over quota. And it was interesting talking to them because obviously they've got a different take on it. And certainly from their perspective, often they would argue that because they've invested in capital and, you know, fishing vessels, that gives them a kind of claim over the quota of the fish. You know, our investment. They talk about our fish, our waters. You know, this sense of it that it's ours, that they own it. And certainly aquaculture, which now delivers over 50% of the fish protein around the world. Scotland's biggest export. It's been an economic triumph from that point of view. The people very concerned about the environmental impacts of it. But it's an increasingly permanent, it's likely to be a permanent feature of our marine environment. And the aquaculture now gets planning permission, and that's in perpetuity. And when a salmon farm is bought and sold, then that planning permission moves as the salmon farm company is bought and sold. So in a sense, you could argue that that is a kind of property that's being created because it's an asset, access to that space to prosecute aquaculture, and it can be traded effectively. So I would argue that we're moving in the direction of creating property. There's offshore wind as well, which is going to bring huge change. I'm going to talk about that now. I'll come back to it because I've got a couple of slides later on. I just wanted to digress and have a wee chat about fishing here to kind of highlight another couple of features which I think are really important about how industry develops and industry has developed historically at sea. And it gives me a chance to show some nice photographs of Stromness, and that's Stromness up in the top right there. As well as this kind of concentration of ownership when you create property rights, and we've seen it on the land, 243 people was it, and half of Scotland. We also see as technology develops that we kind of substitute capital for labour. So on land, it was about new agricultural practices, sort of moving people out, and ultimately, well, not in medieval times, but the 18th century, the kind of industrialisation of agriculture. And that's something we see in fisheries as well. You go back to 1900, that's roughly when that picture was taken, top right there in Stromness. There was about 11,000 vessels. I don't know where I got that figure from, somewhere authoritative. It's pretty exact looking, so it must be 11,275 vessels and 35,000 fishers in Scotland. And over 97% of that was sailing craft, because that was the technology that was available at the time. And a huge percentage of this was actually a fleet that followed herring around Scotland. It had to move with the herring because if you're relying on sail, you can't travel very far. And also the ability, you know, so you can't spend too long in the sea because you've got a product that goes stale, needs to be brought ashore and processed. There's no refrigeration, so it's got to be salted and transported. So it was a whole industry that moved around. It was very, very labour intensive. And there is that picture of Stromness again. And if I were up at the old academy, I don't know if Neil isn't sitting up there, he's sitting at home. You know, that would have been the view from the old academy in Stromness out over the harbour and the herring fleet going out. As I said, that followed the industry around. Just trying to remember, it was about 11,000, I've forgotten all in data already, 11,000 vessels, 35,000 fishers in Scotland, 1900. Then the first big sort of technological breakthrough after that was steam. So late, you know, in 1882, there was only 7 boats in Scotland. In 1914, about 1,000 boats with 15 to 20 horsepower, that is the sort of size of motor that people on the Loch of Harry who goes fishing for trout actually use. I mean, it's not very powerful, but it was a huge innovation at the time because you didn't have to wait on wind. You weren't constrained by the direction of wind. You could travel a lot further offshore, a lot bigger nodes, and it was rapidly adopted. And we saw a large decline in the number of vessels because the individual vessels were getting more powerful and larger nets. The next big step was diesel, and again that was adopted really rapidly, and particularly just after the Second World War. So where are we now? Well, here we go. On the left is a typical pelagic vessel in Scotland. So the pelagics, herring, yeah, mackerel, blue white, and that kind of thing. That's the Charisma. It's registered in Shetland, 71 meters, 8,000 horsepower. It's got a crew of 15, that vessel. You look across the fleet in Scotland, 19,000, there's 11,000 vessels, 35,000 fishers. In 2013, 2,000 vessels, 4,000 fishers. Of those vessels, only 24 of them were a kind of pelagic fleet. 24 vessels in Scotland for all the herring, all the mackerel, all the blue whiting and these other things that we didn't even fish for back in 1900. Point I'm making here is about the kind of concentration in capital as time progresses. The other point about fishery is the quota, okay? Here's an interesting fact, if I can remember it. Yeah, I've got it. There's 24 pelagic vessels. There are only 5 family businesses own 50% of the Scottish quota, over 50% of the Scottish quota. So it's like land, over time, concentration in a small number of hands, the importance of investment in capital, and yeah, as I said, this kind of concentration in a small number once you sort of create property, and that's what we did around quota. Right, just before I check my time, 24 minutes, not too far off. Getting to the end now and finally getting on to wind and what's happening. Well, what we're seeing, you know, there's a slower revolution around fishing. There has been a revolution in aquaculture. It's now providing over 50% of our protein production from the seas. But still, in terms of actual sea space, relatively modest. But look at what's going to happen and what is happening with offshore wind at the minute. The first offshore wind development in the UK was North Hoyle, which is not on the map on the left. It was off Lancashire coast in the Irish Sea. 60 megawatts. I think that was 30 turbine, 32, 30 times 2 megawatt wind turbines. But 2022 now, there's over 2,000 operational wind turbines in the UK offshore sector, and that's delivering over 10,000 megawatts of power. So it's just under half of the wind energy power installed capacity in the UK. There's still slightly more offshore. But most of you here will be aware, should be, of the Scotland leasing round, which has just announced 17 projects. Let's just think about this kind of concentration. That's 17 projects, essentially 17 companies, because most of these are multi-partner projects that have been formed to deliver this. And we're looking at 25,000 megawatts. Scotland on its own will double, Scotland on its own, never mind what's happening around England, will double UK wind energy production. And we're looking at something like 7,000 square kilometres of sea, which is going to be given over to offshore wind, quite rightly. Never mind. I'm not trying to be pejorative about that for a second. The European Commission estimates that Europe's going to need something like 400 to 450 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050. In that ballpark is what we're looking at. Now, if you told me that 10 years ago, I wouldn't have thought it was possible. But the pace of development that's happened in offshore wind, and looking at what's going to happen in Scotland, looking at how floating offshore is going to cause all this to move north, as it will give access to sort of deeper and deeper waters. I can't actually believe that. But with 400 gigawatts, you're looking at over 117,000 square kilometres. That's about 1.5 times the size of Scotland. That's just in Europe. That's just Europe. Never mind the States, never mind China, which is going to invest in offshore wind at an absolute pace. There's a whole range of things that have happened to make this available, but it's absolutely dramatic how the cost of offshore wind has fallen. And I've had people actually in the industry tell me that they are absolutely astonished. They didn't believe it themselves. The price, the cost of wind from the cost of electricity from offshore wind could have fallen so far. And there's a whole range of reasons for this, but a lot of them are tied up in economies of scale in the economic jargon. Part of that's the actual size of the device. So devices have got larger and larger, and that's picture that I nicked from Dong Energy is sort of well out of date, because I think that was out on the right hand side. There's a 10 megawatt device with 113 meter diameter across the turbine blades. But by 2035, a lot of experts are talking about 17 megawatt and devices with over 250 meter sort of diameter. So it creates these sort of enormous efficiencies around installation. There's all sorts of other efficiencies have happened as well, competition in the supply chain, because the investors now have confidence in wind, that the cost of finance has come down because they're prepared to invest at lower rates of return. They're confident it's going to work. So you see these economies of scale, but again, it's that point I'm making about that kind of investment in capital, and also this kind of concentration of economic power as well in a relatively small number of people. We had 30,000 fishers in the North Sea. When we go to wind, we're going very quickly to, well, there's going to be a lot of people employed. But in terms of ownership, that's Scotland, that's 17 organisations that are going to own 25,000 gigawatts of installed capacity. Then I guess the argument that that isn't clear, that I probably should have made about 3 or 4 slides ago, is that I see a process on land, and I don't see it. It's demonstrable. It's happened on land, where as the economy has developed, over a large period of time, we have enclosed the land and created private property, and that's synonymous with economic development and capitalism. In fact, as I said, when Russia was opened up after perestroika, the International Monetary Fund insisted that private property was created. They would not listen to any alternative. It had to be created before Western money would flood in to prop the USSR, the Soviet Union, up in the early 1990s. We could argue that led to oligarchs. I would argue that it's natural for economic players to want to gain control over the resources and de-risk their activity. And the way that they naturally do that, because they've learned on land, is by the creation of trying to get private property rights over your assets. And I would argue that that is a potential direction of travel in the sea. I've only got a couple of slides left. You'll be glad to hear. We do have planning in the sea, and it's been racing along. And has to be said that marine renewables has been one of the key drivers of the development of this planning process. We're very slow to get planning in the sea in the UK. And even aquaculture didn't really do it, because we gave aquaculture planning over to local authorities, and it's dealt with at the moment as part of the terrestrial planning process, bizarrely. But we are developing planning at sea now. I put this slide up. Excuse me. You might recognize some of the faces. Oh gosh, I'm in there as well. Where this is a planning game that Marine Scotland was taken around the Scotland to help local communities and local stakeholders understand the challenges of planning. How do you sort of minimise conflicts between aquaculture, wave winds, fishing, whatever. How to, and help communities understand the sort of challenges of dividing up this space. But I kind of feel that very often sort of planning's almost a process. It's almost like a referee in a football match. It's about trying to kind of ensure fair play and access to, minimising, negative impacts of one kind of development on another. And that's a good thing. And it's a useful thing to do. And it's all part of this kind of need for people to become more literate about the kind of governance of our seas, because most people just have no idea how the seas are governed. But I also think we're missing a debate, because what we're doing is we're talking about, well, where people should go. But we're absolutely not having a debate about this idea of ownership and governance and what we want from our seas. There's a kind of implicit assumption that it will be developed, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but what's happening is we're starting to see a drip of private rights being created, and we've seen it in fishing, we see it in agriculture with planning. We're not there yet with offshore wind. It is leased from the Crown Estate, and the Crown Estate manages the seabed on behalf of the population. But the reason that I wanted to raise this as a discussion point is that if we end up in a situation, if we do not have this debate and say, what are the limits on private property? If we end up in a situation where we create it in the sea, and I think there's a strong likelihood we will, it will be almost impossible to undo once it's done, in the same way that it's almost impossible to undo on land. And communities around the world are trying to fight back against that kind of unjust sort of distribution of the land resource. So we've seen what's happened on land. And a lot of us sit back and go, well, how the hell did that happen? How did 400 people end up owning 50% of Scotland? How did we end up with these unfair land rights, around the rest of the world? Why is it so difficult to undo? My concern is that not tomorrow, not in 10 years' time, in 50 years' time, we might end up with a situation like that in the sea. So industrialisation of the sea is happening. I'm not saying it's a bad thing, and we need offshore wind. Another thing that I should have mentioned as I went along, it's qualitatively different about what's happening in the sea at the minute with agriculture and wind is permanence. Now, wind developers are being given leases for, forgive me, I should know, 25 years. They will be repowered. We need that energy, and we're going to keep needing it. And crikey, we're going to need it fast, given what's happening, terrible things that are happening in Europe today, and we need to wean ourselves off that gas. So as far as I'm concerned, that's permanent, and that's new. We always knew the oil and gas sector was a temporary thing. It had to be. The oil's going to run out. So that's new. We've not created private property in the sea yet, but there is a process underway where we're giving rights to companies, individuals, even individual families in the case of fishing. It's not a conspiracy. I'm not saying it is, but we're not having a debate about it. And I think that would be a good thing to do. Because at the end of the day, it's your sea. And we need to decide what we want to see in our seas. So thanks for hanging on there. I hope I didn't send anybody to sleep. I'm 6 minutes over. Forgive me. but if anybody feels like asking a question, I'll do my damnedest to answer it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sandy. That was really, really interesting. Certainly didn't send me to sleep. Raised many questions. I will open up the floor for general questions. Hi, Sandy. I think you scared them away. And now I've got things saying my internet connection is unstable. So I hope I'm still there. Yeah, I think it's really interesting from the point of view. I mean, what are the models? I mean, it's like unclaimed land. I was always fascinated in Scotland that you do have, as you say, positive prescription, that you can decide, I found this bit of land that's not owned by anyone and claiming it. Yeah. And that's effectively what we're doing now. I mean, and there's other bits, I mean, I was fascinated in Iceland where they have a very different property approach. And there is large chunks of land that aren't owned by anyone. And the Danes took it all, you know what I mean, in a similar way. But what I agree. I mean, it's a real dilemma for us because, I mean, the opportunity to power the country or even the continent in a clean way, in a sustainable way, is huge. Yeah. And it gives us robustness in a way that gets us out of some difficult questions that we're experiencing now. Where does our warmth and where does our energy come from? Yeah. But at what cost? And how? I mean, I'm known as a lefty liberal, but I mean, how do we socialize this? How do we make this fair and inclusive? Yeah. I mean, I in some ways, you could argue we're in a bit of a sweet spot potentially at the minute, because we have state ownership of the seabed, and you know, money you need to pay a rent, and that money comes back to the state one way or another. Can argue about that and how it's distributed, and whether it should come sort of, you know, more directly back to communities that are close to it. Or whether it should just go into the, you know, whether it's Westminster or the purse in Edinburgh. But I think that, you know, I still come back to this point. I think there is a real danger of a sort of drift in a direction. And we did it with fisheries. You know, we've actually given, we've given individual quota to people, and which is tradable. So we sort of created property there. And I think there is naturally always that pressure there by anybody prosecuting an economic activity. They want to get control over the resources to de-risk it. But I think we're possibly in a sweet spot at the minute. And I would like to see something almost like a constitution of the sea, you know, or a Bill of Rights, saying there are limits to what we're going to allow people to do, and sort of take ownership of the sea, and actually sort of confirm that is public. That's what I would actually like to see in the kind of long run. But we're not having that conversation at all. You know, we're having conversations around planning about deciding what goes where, and sort of playing God with maps and allocating chunks of land. But we're not thinking beyond that about, well, you know, who owns this, and, you know, what boundaries are we prepared to put on this ownership? And I think we're naive if we don't think it will end up in something like private property in 50 years' time. No, I agree. I think it's really interesting you picked up on the oil industry, where people face the same thing. They're going to put a huge amount of money in, but they knew it was a temporary thing, so they bought the right to exploit that resource. But they've had to hand it back. They've had to make good, and the process of making good. They've had to make
good and hand it back, and it's also spatially really small. I mean, the areas of sea that we're talking about are absolutely fantastic. You know, absolutely. I say meeting Europe's energy needs. We're talking about a chunk of sea the size of, well, about 1.5 times the size of Scotland, being covered in wind turbines. I'm not saying for a second it's a bad thing. I think it's almost a technological miracle, but it's going to bring changes to how we manage what's happening in the sea.
Well, dotted with them, because there's obviously it's not a complete land take in that sense, and there's gaps in between.
Well, it's not all going to be in one place, yeah.
And also, space between that. And we'll open it up because Neil's just about desperate to talk. I can just see you coming in there. Now. But just the final thing, it's interesting you say. I'm quite interested with the idea there's a sweet spot with state-owned sea, because you made reference to what's happening in the east. quite interesting, the state-owned oil companies, the state-owned bulk vessels and tankers. A third of the global fleet is Russian flag.
Yeah, that's yeah. It's funny we're all discovering these things.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
It's quite alarming. Yeah.
If I can jump in, it was really interesting, and very stimulating. Okay. Thanks for the perspective on all that stuff. I was going to pick up on the point that Mark made about the fact that the turbines are going to be spaced apart. There's going to be a distance of sea between them. However, there are going to be controls now from EMEC's point of view. Back in the day, when we looked at installing stuff like certainly on the tidal site, we had opportunities to establish exclusive zones. So offshore energy renewable installation. I can't remember what it stands for now. There was a 4-letter acronym, which was basically the exclusion zone around turbines to protect the turbines. And we decided very clearly not to do that because it would actually stop at the sea, because you joined the 500-meter circles up and suddenly you've created a fence. But you can also imagine that there are going to be needs to protect these socially important assets, i.e. it is our power supply out there. I don't want people fannying around out there and near and damaging the network. And it's going to be really interesting to see how that public imperative to have a secure energy supply is going to be balanced against the need to have a degree of control over the seabed. The other thing I think will be interesting is whether his point about multiple use of the sea. In other words, yes, you can plant a turbine there, but actually you can fish in an area nearby as long as the fishing technique is compatible with the sort of thing you put in the sea. So don't go dredging it, but you might be able to gill net it or something. It'll be interesting to see whether there are shared uses. So I wonder if you've got any examples of sort of shared uses of land.
Yeah,
which might give us a different angle.
Really, really interesting. It's certainly the case that on land, it tends to be that one use absolutely dominates. I mean, sometimes you'll get rights split out, but it tends to be one use dominates. And then the sea is inherently more multi-use. That's bad English, I'm sure, but you know what I'm trying to say. Just pick up on a couple of points that you said there. Certainly with fishing, it looks like a lot of people are looking at you can fish in around legally. There is a very small sort of safety zone around, very small around a turbine. You can fish in around them, but from a practical point of view, certainly something like pair trawling or pelagic seine netting is just too big. You just cannot do it. And also when we move into floating wind, with the kind of foundation with sort of catenary anchor mooring systems that we're looking at, then the footprints a lot bigger. So but there will be probably some sort of compatible sort of fishing techniques. How this sort of pans out for the fishing industry, sort of good or bad in the long run, goodness knows, because there's a lot of people saying it might be a kind of sanctuary for fish, so that might actually lead to a net benefit. And of course, this is all happening against a backdrop of climate change, where the environment's changing anyway. So all the fish species are moving north, and the fishing industry will undoubtedly follow them as well. So it's really difficult to see the future going forward. On the issue of multi-use, sort of beyond that, certainly there's been a lot of work looking at some work looking at offshore wind and aquaculture, particularly shellfish culture in the southern North Sea. And it was possible to combine wind and sort of mussel culture or something like that, and sort of multi-use. From an economic point of view, you tend to find that the developers, when there's been work done sort of talking to them, the wind developers, would really rather it wasn't there, because they just see it as an additional risk, sort of vessels around and so on. And the economic gain from the mussel farm is so tiny compared to the wind farm. On the other hand, it might be something that's just made a requirement of the government. Government could turn around and say, no, we want this to happen.
The bit I was thinking was, Sandy, is whether you got examples of multi-land use. That's the piece I was wondering about, whether
it's much less common, in that you tend to have, one use dominates and it's the one that can generate all the cash, but you will get, things like sporting rights. So people, for hunting, shooting, fishing, that kind of thing, in the same space as agriculture. But it's not, I need to sit and think about that, but it's a lot less common on land. It tends to be one use economically dominates, and that's that's what gets access.
I'm tempted to say for onshore wind, Sandy, we do have that.
Oh, I suppose, yeah.
Yeah, because I mean, we have the wind farms, and you have agriculture happening around it, yeah. Or even Hammer Hill, famously encouraging nesting birds because they're left alone now. You know what I mean? Because the farmers aren't. So it's kind of an interesting one. I was sitting listening there and just thinking, as you say, this could be such a large area of seabed take. I think that if developers could avoid the hassle, they would, but I don't think they may get that opportunity. And it may be in a contrary way, almost what Neil's touching on, to be a democratization of fisheries. We have a long line of fixed netting because we have to, you know what I mean?
Yeah, which are environmentally more sustainable.
Yeah.
You picked on a really interesting point there. There's certainly been exercise in my mind the past few days with, I don't even want to say the word Ukraine, it's so depressing. But, thinking about energy security and, that's one positive thing. That's going to be a big push for renewables, there's no doubt about it. This sort of not wanting to rely on gas. But actually, you have to think about actually defending it. And, the actual physical defense of this, essential piece of infrastructure, and you do wonder about that and that aspect of energy security for a nation like the UK. Yeah. Anybody else? So Neil was always good for a good question. Mind you, we're just about up in time.
Oh, you're crumbs. It's flown by then. Oh, it's 3 minutes too.
Oh, you mean I've talked too much?
Yeah. Mark's put his camera back on. I don't like because he's just brewing with a great question. I'll have to. How do we do that? Okay, yeah, done. No, definitely not.
Sorry, no great questions.
Yeah. How do we do the sticky thing then? How do we get the value, Sandy, for all of us that are going to suddenly have this swathe of turbines and cabling around our islands?
I think that's really, really, really interesting. And I think back to, I think it's always good to look at history. And you look at oil and gas and how Shetland, and to a lesser extent, Orkney did well financially out of oil and gas. And it worked because Orkney and Shetland suddenly find themselves with a hell of a lot of leverage, a particular kind of sort of point in time when the UK economy was on its knees. We were getting bailed out with the IMF in 72, 73, never mind Russia in the 1990s. And we were desperate for those tax revenues. And the oil obviously had to come ashore somewhere, and the closest place was Shetland and Orkney. And that gave those two communities, our communities, a huge amount of political leverage at the time. And what they did was they got the Zetland and Orkney County Council Act, which gave compulsory purchase powers, which allowed them to buy the land where the terminals went, and then it allowed them to get a sort of rent and revenue from the land. So, with a huge amount of sort of direct financial flows came from that. The trouble with offshore wind is that we don't have the same leverage as communities. And if you look at, it'd be interesting to see how this develops. And actually, I had another slide that I decided not to put in about community benefit payments from offshore wind at the moment. There are some, but they're extremely, what can I say, heterogeneous. They're, sometimes it's a cash payment, sometimes it's like the local football team or a charity scholarship fund. It tends to be, and this was a slide I haven't put in, but literally people with big checks in the newspaper handing over to community group rather small amounts of money. So at the moment, the community benefits are very much CSR, corporate social responsibility type payments. a gift. The offshore wind is deciding how much, who gets it, and what it goes to, which is different from the situation on land, where you've got these, more standardised benefit payments that have emerged, and very different where you've got community ownership on land, where they just take the profits. So it's a real challenge. Yeah, there's going to be lots of other good benefits in terms of, to Orkney, if we get the economic trickle down from Scapa Flow becomes a transshipment hub and so on, not transshipment, sorry, a servicing hub. But in terms of, like we got from oil and gas, it's quite hard to see how it happens.
No, I know. I was delighted to see that they in the auction they put it up from 10 to 25% local content, but no one's defining exactly what the local is, whether that's a national level or not. But quick back of the fag packet thing for the point of view of the onshore 5,000 per megawatt installed, and I know there's huge issues with community benefit. I'm really, really nervous about community benefit after being both a community councillor and working with community councils across the Highlands, but also working with community energy. That's 15 million a year if you just take the two sides either side of Orkney at the moment, just based on the 5,000 per megawatt. And I feel something like that, the gift to Orkney was the cost of travelling through the flow, the per barrel cost, and something like that as a minimum. But I don't know how embedded, because that's not coming forward at the moment. It's this more nebulous, what's 25% of local value. I'm not sure.
Yeah, because frankly, well, it's difficult to see where the leverage is.
Yeah, exactly.
But that's almost a different presentation.
Yeah, it is absolutely. So Becky's put a camera on as well. So.
Yeah. Oh.
No, I was just going to ask a question about how we make this connection between rights and responsibilities. So if you have the right to have an installation, how do we trade that against the responsibility you then have to the local communities who are close by to that?
It's a good question. I mean, I think we are seeing a bit of a change. If you look at the new Crown Estate Act, for example, the Crown Estate that manages a seabed, the old Crown Estate Act, 1964 Act, I think it was, its sole priority was to maximise the financial return from the estate. That was it. That's what it was held to. And increasingly, now there's a kind of sustainable development community kind of clause in there that they should be development, but they should be aware of the impacts on communities. So it's not just about maximising income. And we're starting to see kind of flows of money as well, bits and pieces sort of coming, but to communities. So, but I think, back to your question, I think that is the role of government. And what kind of frustrates me a bit with marine, go back to the marine planning, is that gosh, I think there's some marine planners in there. but they didn't, the system's been created essentially. It's that there's almost a kind of, we referee in a game, and we just need to make sure that that we minimise sort of overlap and conflict, and everybody plays by the rules. But I think government should actually be trying to stick up for communities, not just kind of stand back and say, well, as long as everybody follows the rules, that's okay. Then it's just because we don't have a strong voice in what's happening in the marine environment. And there is in marine planning, this kind of absolute presumption in favour of development that, and the voice of, do not think for a second I'm anti-wind development, I'm absolutely not. But in the process, the voice of communities is very weak, and there's a presumption in favour of the developer all the time, right down to the point where with aquaculture, the only person that has a right to appeal at any stage is the developer, and the community doesn't like it. Tough. So I think that getting back to your question, that's the responsibility of government, and I do not believe they're really taking that responsibility on board.
I was going to pick up on, because that makes me nervous. And as you were saying, what's the lever? We've just had ScotWind round options, 600 million gone centrally to Scottish government, and this isn't a political point. what's our lever to stop that? What's that lever for that to be distributed to the areas and that are affected by that? At the moment, I'm not seeing it, Andy.
Well,
I
think the first thing is actually awareness, because most people are just completely oblivious to what's going on in our seas, let alone aware of their kind of rights that they have, because it is ours if it's anybody's at the moment. But that lack of awareness creates a situation where things, people who are aware, the economic interests will, obviously it's totally understandable, sort of work a system in their favour. So I think for me, we talk about ocean literacy, and it's often about understanding the environment of the seas, and there's a big ocean literacy movement out there as well. But I think also the sort of governance of it. People in this country, weirdly, because we're an island, just completely unaware of what's happening out there, who controls it, and what the future of our seas like, and what our stake in it is.
So to suppose Annie's put quite a lot in the chat. Did you want to speak to any of that, Annie, or we just it's interesting stuff, and it's showing the small amounts already. I'm guessing those figures are the actuals that Orkney's got from the leasing share over the last few years.
Hi, I can a little bit, but I love this conversation because I was just reading something today about marine planning and how I was just about to pull up a quote, and it's designed, marine planning is designed to sort of strategically, enable development. Really, that's from the get-go.
Yeah.
And it is a referee. It's to use all the statutory tools at hand to support development. Really, it all goes hand in glove with blue growth. So that was what I was just thinking about. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, not bad. It's a wee bit muffled.
Okay. So that was just my comment there. Do you have a question, Mark?
Can I just pick up on that? And I think it's interesting if you look at the kind of main protagonists, if you like, in this allocation of space in the marine environment, it's kind of the blue growth industries and kind of conservation interests, and mostly kind of formal kind of conservation. And that's what's kind of duking it out, if you like. Community voice doesn't really get heard very much at all. It's very different on land, of course, but it's very much a kind of contest between those.
Well, just within Orkney, I've been thinking a lot about like what kind of literacy is needed, actually. So I think carbon literacy is one, but just actually not just understanding the sea space and understanding the different jurisdictions like 0 to 12, and people realize that Scapa Pier is going to get a big development, that the different pier infrastructure is going to get bigger. There's new offshore wind coming in, and so I think there is probably confusion about what all these different industries represent to the community, when in reality, there's different zones. There's 0 to 12, and then there's the offshore, and there's quite different methodologies for how that gets evaluated, which you touched on earlier about community benefits from these large scale operations. So it's quite, I would be really interested to find out how to how and what, the who, what, why, where, how much people need to understand, that probably a lot, about how it all works. So I do think there's a big need for that. that's a really good point that you made.
And fundamentally, I 600 million for the options to lease, and Neil's got a question coming in. And people should be asking, where's that money gone? Who's got that? Sorry, Neil.
So you've touched on a point there. I was just going to offer some experience that we had, and that was we had a bit of a stooshy with the Crown Estate back in the day when we first started off at EMEC, and I have to say Crown Estate Scotland have been a breath of fresh air compared with their our colleagues south of the border in just off Regent Street, but we had real problems, and the unaccountability of the Crown Estate at the time was a real issue, because we were going, right, bugger this, where's the minister, let's go and find out who they report into, and it was almost impenetrable. It was basically into Treasury, and there was no sort of mechanism to get in there and try and get a degree of rationality as we saw it. Now, I suppose one of the challenges is going to be to make sure that if there is a controlling mind, that the state continues to have that role is probably the best we can hope for at the moment. The whole piece about the most efficient state being a benevolent dictatorship, occasionally moderated by assassination. But in the case of what we need to do with the making sure that the roles and responsibilities of the Crown Estate of Scotland do actually continue to match the needs of the nation. And I think I'm much more confident that they do now, because they were badly out of step back in the day when it was just the Crown Estate. But I'm pleased to say that I think we're in the right sort of direction at the moment. But I'm not necessarily sure that there's that mechanism for easy feedback or accountability. And I think as we become more interested in the sea, so we need to have a mechanism to engage with it better. And it'd be interesting to see how that develops. I was interested in your point about there being some sort of forum for these discussions, and I don't get the feeling that's part of the marine planning process. No, it's not. No, it's refereeing as opposed to discursive, and it does seem to be an interesting point there that probably ought to think about what that should look like. Yeah, absolutely. Right. There's planning on land has changed a lot as well. It kind of went through a bit of a crisis in the 1980s, when it used to be something that a bunch of boffins with slide rules back in the day went into a room and kind of planned everything out and then launched it on everybody. And then we ended up, with what we now call planning through debate. So, on land, you get endlessly consulted about everything. And marine planners have tried to adopt that. So they're good at consulting, but we're not having a conversation about the more fundamentals. Whose is this? And, what should there be kind of limits on what we allow to happen in terms of the money, where it goes and who has access to it. And, I do think that, we almost need a sort of constitution or something for the sea. I agree with you that the Crown Estate Scotland, there's been huge advances, but it's still a kind of weird ad hoc kind of thing. And, that could change very easily. Yeah.
Is the lessons to be learned for what we haven't done well with oil exploration in Arctic communities and around the northern periphery as well? Because I feel that's my worry. I'm not seeing the leverage for Orkney and Shetland and the Outer Isles. I'm seeing us potentially being the neighbours, seeing the result of there'll be very responsible bits falling off, marine littering, all the rest. We're going to get that, and the cables may just go straight past us.
Well, the cables will.
Exactly. Yeah. Sorry. Anything else before I go off on too much of a rant? And any other questions at this point? It's really good, Sandy. I don't know the standard form as far as it's a while since I've chaired anything like this. If we have anything else other than telling people to drive home safely, which we don't have to do anymore, so it's really fine. No, thank you, Sandy. That was really, really good.
Thanks for putting up with that and my, kind of rather kind of wacky interests, but in the marine environment, it's good. And I still had it's Shrove Tuesday and I haven't had my pancakes yet.
That's true. Yeah.
So I was doing my last efforts in the presentation, so I'm going to go and do that now.
No, you should. But it's hugely timely. As you say, 25 gigawatt around us, and it's a prelude. It's a prelude to 20 times more that's going to come, as you say, and I can't see why it won't. And it's, you know,
it's a technological marvel, and it may well save us.
Yeah, exactly. It may save the world, but
it is going to bring change. It's going to bring big change, and it's this permanence. It's not going away.